Clearly, something devastating happening this morning at the World Trade Center.
We're trying to process what actually happened.
To be here, it's hard to believe. It's a bad dream.
And baseball just happened to be the right vehicle at the right time to help us cope.
I feel honored that we gave the people something to feel good about.
That was from the new documentary Extra Innings from 9/11 20 years later. It tells the story of how baseball helped aid both New York City and the nation recover in the weeks and months following the attacks of 9/11. We're joined now by the producers and directors of the documentary, Ross Greenburg and Joe Lavine. Fellas, thank you for joining us.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
You're both acclaimed Emmy and Peabody award-winning filmmakers. Ross, you were the president of HBO Sports for 10 years. Both very experienced people in the industry. What made you want to take on this particular subject?
Let you start that off, Ross.
Okay. Well, I got a call from Sandy Montag, who great entrepreneur in our business, and he had sold this concept to Turner, who in turn had HBO Max standing by to broadcast it. So he asked if I'd be interested in producing and directing this film. So immediately I said yes, because I had had the great joy of working with Joe Lavine on a similar project that we did 15, 16 years ago for HBO when we were there. And we had done something right after 9/11. A couple of years later, we did a piece called 9 Innings from Ground Zero, where we looked at this same subject, but from a different point of view. So I immediately called Joe and said, would you like to do this with me? Because we like to work together, and it had been a while. So we ended up embarking on this journey and loving every minute of it.
It's an important piece. I mean, it's, I think it was, and Ross, you can correct me, I think it was Howard Cosell that said that sports is the toy department of life. And for the most part, that's probably true. But this really crossed over, and this was an important piece historically, telling people's stories, looking back on the 20 years, catching up with some of the people we met 15, 16 years ago, and bringing up to date where their lives are today. So it really did take on a lot of importance and a lot of responsibility. And I couldn't wait to work with Ross on this.
You know, I never heard sports are the toy section of life.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm going to steal
Howard Cosell.
Love that. Thank you. And so for those who don't know, you all actually made another 9/11 documentary 20 years ago, 9 Innings from Ground Zero. Now, this new film features interviews from some of the family members of the fallen people 2 decades ago. But what stood out to you the most after revisiting this story 20 years later?
Well, one of the things we did was enlist Joe Torre and Bobby Valentine to be our guides. That was important to us. They had such a unique perspective, having been inside with the Mets and Yankees as the managers and heading their ship. And so it was important to enlist them. The thing that surprised, I think, Joe and I the most was basically that now we were living in a pandemic, and for us to kind of go back and see the desperation that existed in New York, in our city, because Joe and I both lived in New York at the time, and then to see where we are as an entire country today, and to kind of just look back and say, okay, how did we get back to some normalcy then? How did we get out of that funk then and return to life with a smile on our face from such devastating tragedy? And that, the surprise was that we came out of this process, and Joe and I loved the fact that we had hope. It gave people hope. Even though everyone's shedding a tear, we're getting reactions now for those that watch it, and everyone's crying their eyes out. That those tears aren't of supreme sadness; they're of kind of hope, and that's what we love about this film.
I just want to say when Ross and I did this years ago, I have to admit I was skeptical, because here I'm finding out what baseball helps these people who just lost someone near and dear to them, and it's baseball. But when we started to do the research and we started to talk to people, I was shocked to find out that, in fact, was true. I was finding out that for 2, 3, maybe 4 hours a night while they watched a game, they could kind of get back to normalcy a little bit. And it started what we call the healing. So then to take that and what I learned back then, and now to take it 20 years forward, and to go back now and talk to some of those same people who we talked to back then, and then new people, because this does have, most of the stories in this show are new stories to the subject that we did back then. There's only a couple that we go back and revisit. But I was skeptical in the beginning, and it surprised me. I mean, I starting with Ross, I'll never forget walking past his office after Game 3, which was the game where George Bush threw out the first ball. And Ross looked at me and he says, "I have our next documentary." And I had no idea what he was talking about. I mean, this is just a couple weeks after 9/11, and he's telling me that. And Ross can really touch on that better than me. But that was, the first time I thought, what, you could do this as a show? And that was all Ross at that point.
I had just been to Game 3. I was sitting there witnessing it. And then as I left the stadium, I high-fived 10 cops because I was a Yankee fan, full disclosure. I high-fived 10 cops. And at that moment, when I high-fived the 10th, I said, "Oh, my God, I'm living a documentary." And that's why the next morning I pulled Joe into the office.
What do you think it was about baseball in particular that allowed people to rally around it? Of course, the Yankees were involved, and they were a great team at that time, and they were in the World Series. But it feels like a lot of this is particular to baseball, unique to baseball.
Well, first of all, baseball is played every night as opposed to football's once a week. Hockey hadn't really started yet. Basketball hadn't really started up yet. Just football had just started. So baseball is in every, it's there. It's especially in New York at the time. The Mets had a great year the year before, had been to the World Series and played the Yankees. So there was still a lot of interest there. And of course, the Yankees are the Yankees. They were in the postseason, or starts early in the playoffs. So every night you could turn and watch this drama. And not only are you watching the Yankees and the Mets, they started to symbolize New York. It's like, oh, they're fighting back. And whether you bought that or not, it was being displayed every night. So that's why I think the timing of it had so much to do with why so many people turned to baseball.
And in both cases, there was a development with the community. Bobby Valentine. We went into depth this time with the Mets as well as the Yankees, because we wanted to kind of show how Bobby Valentine led a core of Mets, including John Franco, who was an all-time great Met who grew up in New York.
Brooklyn guy,
Brooklyn guy. So we wanted to kind of portray that and then lead into the Piazza game, which to this day is one of the great home run moments in the history of the game, not just because of the drama of doing in the bottom of the eighth, but set against 9/11. And then, of course, the Yankee run all the way through the World Series. The other thing is 60,000 would congregate at this stadium every night. And then, of course, you had millions watching, especially when it was the World Series. So the drama went up a notch. And the fact that 9/11 was so closely followed by all this incredibly insane drama on the field, these home runs of Jeter and Tino and Brocious out of nowhere. It just, those moments would never have been forgotten, but the fact that they followed 9/11 make them insurmountable.
It's interesting because Jason asked about what was it about baseball for 9/11, but I'm curious, what is it about sports and moments of tragedy? You look at 2020 and what happened with the civil unrest, and basketball took the lead, because, again, timing of it is what you talked about. Basketball was in season during it. We know the athletes went to the bubble and their perspective wobble. So what is it about sports in times of tragedy that just makes the community or our nation gravitate towards it?
I think it's because you can get so many people in one setting, first of all, so that when, Bush goes out to the mound, you can chant USA in unison, and millions are also watching that kind of energy. And so on the field, wherever you are during a moment of crisis, that's where people congregate. If it was a concert, that would be fine too. But there aren't these moments where you can feel the energy from so many about one historic kind of moment. And so tragedy turns into momentous occasions, I guess.
And I think it also has a little bit to do with the as I call it, the healthy distraction, that you could get away from something that's so horrific for a couple hours at a time. And I think that's why people turn to, whether it be sports or, something else that's near and dear to them. But in our case, absolutely in sports.
And that the one thing I also thought about with sports is that the passion people bring to it, to root for their team, and their heroes. That also, that connection, you don't get that in anything else, but you get that in sports. So if you're a Met fan and you're watching that game, I'm getting chills as I say it, I'm a Yankee fan. Bottom of the eighth, man on, down by a run, post 9/11, first game back at Shea, and Mike Piazza gets in the batter.
It was one of the loudest bat cracks, too, that I think I've ever heard. It was like, pock! You just heard it.
You're right. Whoever did the audio that night for that game should be rewarded. You're right. Something else.
Yeah. A big part of this doc is about the 2001 World Series between the Yankees and the Diamondbacks. New York went down 2 games very early, then rallied back in the series, winning 3 in a row, and ultimately the D-backs took it in 7. But it's an interesting what if, right? Like, what would have happened if the Yankees won that? What do you think?
We've thought about that. Joe and I have thought about that for 20 years.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, when we ended this one, and Joe will expand on it too, we felt like we kind of encapsulated the fact that games 3, 4, and 5 were really the story. The fact they were at Yankee Stadium and those incredible home runs happened, those, down to the last out in 4, and down to the last out in 5, 2 home runs to even up the score back to back on consecutive nights. The Bush pitch, I think it was Bernie Williams in the doc who said it best. He kind of said, I was proudest to be a professional ball player during that World Series. And he meant those moments, that's what it was all about. The fact that the Yankees were doing that at home post 9/11, that's what it was all about. It wasn't the fact that Mariano, got lit in the 9th inning in Game 7. That was just, and in a way, it kind of, to see the Diamondbacks rejoice and their fans go wild, that was okay too. It was like defeat sometimes can bring out more drama in a story.
I don't personally, I don't think it would have mattered that much. I mean, it certainly wouldn't have changed anything, anyone's personal situation. But in talking to these people back then and now, this new group of people, it was more, I know it sounds corny, but the journey, 3, 4, and 5, the fighting back. That's what meant so much to everybody, that they represented New York in such an unbelievable way. What the Mets did, what the Yankees did, that it didn't matter at the end of the day that the Yankees lost. It was what they gave back to New York and to baseball fans everywhere.
The film is Extra Innings from 9/11. It's available on HBO Max right now. Check it out. Ross and Joe, thank you for joining us on Takeline.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, fellas.
for having us.